Welcome back to the body defenses in the lymphatic system, part 2. Where we left off was we were in the innate immune system and we were talking about second line of defenses. So what a fever is, it's another part of the non-specific innate immune system. A fever is actually a good thing. So let's talk about why you should not fight the fever unless it's really high. What your fever is it's actually an abnormally high body temperature. But what is that doing for you? So to answer that, we have to differentiate between a fever and something called hyperthermia. So let's remember that the hypothalamus is responsible for your body temperature. And the hypothalamus sets your body temperature at a set point of 98.6 degrees. So because your hypothalamus says your body temperature should be at 98.6 degrees, if it drops below that, you shiver. If it goes above that, you sweat. So if the hypothalamus says, okay, I changed my mind. I want you to be at 99, or I want you to be at 102. Then you're going to have a fever. Your muscles will start to contract and generate heat because technically you are cold. Your body temperature is not at the temperature that the hypothalamus is saying it needs to be at. So you will start to shiver to raise your body temperature. And that's different from hyperthermia, which could be caused from external factors. So maybe, we live in Arizona. You decided to go running in July at 2 o'clock in the afternoon along a non-shaded pavement path, right? So it's going to be something caused by like the sun or temperature or a sauna, right? Something external outside of your body. But the fever will actually help inhibit bacterial and viral reproduction because of those high temperatures. And the fever also increases the speed of tissue repair. So it is doing some good there. And with inflammation, inflammation is formed or caused by a lipid mediator called prostaglandin E2. And this prostaglandin promotes inflammation, which also promotes pain, fever, and swelling. So a lot of times there are fever-reducing medications, and those include aspirin, ibuprofen, that inhibit this prostaglandin E2 synthesis. So a fever is usually triggered by some exogenous pyrogen or fever-producing agent, such as a great example is glycoproteins that exist on bacterial and viral surfaces. When your body starts to break down that bacteria, those glycoproteins are a pyrogen, and they will start to induce a fever in your body. There are also endogenous, so inner pyrogens. So these come from within the body, and those include polypeptides that are secreted by neutrophils and macrophages. I'm sorry. They will come into contact with these with certain substances, and they will say, okay, this is a bacteria. We need to raise the body temperature. We need to raise our body temperature so we can kill this bacteria or foreign pathogen. And so they will tell the hypothalamus, hey, we need to change our set point for body temperature. We need to raise our body temp to 102. So then the hypothalamus will raise the body temperature to 102 and cause that shivering and muscle contraction to raise the temperature. I have a great graph of the stages of the fever. So initially we have our normal body temperature, right? And so there's a natural fluctuation there with our normal body temperature, but it stays right around that narrow limit of 98.6 degrees, which is 37 degrees Celsius. Well, then an infection happens, right? Ooh, something got in, and pyrogen has started to be secreted. So that pyrogen is going to tell the hypothalamus, hey, something's in here, and we have to raise our body temperature so that way we can kill this bacteria that has gotten in through our body. And so the hypothalamus is going to say, all right, let's reset that thermostat and we're going to increase that set point. And so now maybe the set point is 102, right? So now we're going to have the body temperature begin to rise. So we have an onset of a fever. And that fever will continue until it reaches the set point that the hypothalamus has now determined, which is maybe 102. And so if we take some kind of medication that reduces the fever, we are just fighting what our body is trying to do with this onset. It is trying to fight an infection. It's trying to kill something that should not be in our body. And so it's going to continue until that pathogen or that threat is gone. So we'll have this body temperature rise until it reaches that set point that the hypothalamus has determined. And then we will have this fluctuation right along that set point, and that is called the stadium. So the body will oscillate right around the new set point, just like it does down here when we have our normal body temperature. And when the body is at stadium, this is when the bacteria is going to be exposed to this high temperature that it can't grow at. It needs to be at 98.6 degrees. So by raising the body temperature to this level for an extended period of time, the body cells and the cells that make up us, they'll survive, but the bacteria won't. And so it will kill the bacteria, it will break down the viruses, it'll start to kill whatever is causing the infection. After that infection started to be cleared and it has now started to end, then the signal will leave the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus will say, okay, the red is gone, we're good. So let's bring our body temperature back down to 98.6 degrees because let's be real, we can't stay at this higher temperature for a prolonged period of time, or it will do some damage. So the body will bring itself back to 98.6 degrees. And this phase, when the body's returning back to normal, is called defervescence. And that's a nice one to have to say. You always have to kind of think about it. Defervescence. The body will return to normal. And so a really serious disorder in children, especially that are younger, like under the age of 15, is that they could have an acute viral infection. Maybe they have COVID-19, or they have influenza or chickenpox, and their parent, trying to help, just gives them aspirin. Well, that can cause what's called Reye's syndrome. And in Reye's syndrome, that is where you have swelling of neurons within the brain. And there is a fatty infiltration of the liver and some other viscera. About 30% of the people who get Reye's syndrome will die. And the survivors will often suffer from mental retardation. But it starts off with just this acute viral infection, and they've been given some Tylenol, or sorry, not Tylenol. They've been given aspirin to try to control that fever. And that will cause a swelling in the brain. And as symptoms, we see nausea, vomiting, and some disorientation, or even seizures and coma. And so we always say never, ever, ever give aspirin to a child who has any flu-like symptoms or who has the chickenpox. And when that's typo, second line of defense, we were in 201, right? Probably a long time ago, but when we were in 201, we talked about tissues. And when we talked about tissues, we learned about inflammation. Inflammation is that local defensive response to any kind of injured tissue, which could include trauma or infection. And there are 4 cardinal signs of inflammation, which hopefully sound familiar. They're inflammation, which includes heat, redness, swelling, and pain. And those 4 are indicators of acute inflammation that are triggered when body cells are injured. And inflammation is actually a good thing as long as the body can keep it under control. And so the inflammation process will limit the spread of pathogens and then destroy them. It will also help remove debris from damaged tissues and initiate some tissue repair. When we look at the inflammation itis, that denotes inflammation of a specific organ. Like we have arthritis, which is inflammation of the joints. We have pancreatitis, which is inflammation of the pancreas, and dermatitis, which is inflammation of the dermis. And so, like I said, we need to keep inflammation in control. So inflammation is regulated by something that is called cytokines. Cytokines are these little small proteins that regulate inflammation and immunity, and they are secreted by our leukocytes. So when the leukocytes secrete these cytokines are like chemical communications from the leukocyte to other cells. And the receiving cell, with their physiology will actually change. And typically, these cytokines will have a short range action. So if they act on neighboring cells, it is said to be paracrine. And if it's acting on the same cell that's going to secrete it, it is an autocrine. And these cytokines include things that we've talked about, like interferon, and they're going to include interleukins, and there are tons of interleukins. It's usually abbreviated as IL. There is also one called tumor necrosis factor, chemotactic factors. Chemo is chemical, taxis is to call, so calling is chemicals, and others. So inflammation has 3 main processes. There is the mobilization of body defenses, and then once those soldiers are deployed, they will have to contain the pathogen and then destroy that pathogen. And then there's always the cleanup crew. So the tissue cleanup and repair. So when it comes to the mobilization of defense, this is when we're going to bring the soldiers in to defend the body. The first thing after tissue injury happens, we have to get our defensive leukocytes to that site very, very quickly. These are the on-the-ground soldiers that are going to come in and make sure no foreign pathogen gets into our body. So how do we get these white blood cells to this site of injury? Well, we are going to increase blood flow. And so increased blood flow is called hyperemia. And that increased blood flow is going to wash toxins along with some metabolic waste away from that site very quickly. And then there's also going to be a local vasodilation. And that vasodilation is due to vasoactive chemicals like the histamines and interleukins and other cytokines that we talked about. Those are going to be secreted by basophils, mast cells, cells that have been damaged due to the trauma, or even by toxins or some other organism that's triggering the inflammation. And so when you increase the blood flow to an area, that area is going to turn redder, which we call hyperemia. So we are bringing in the defenses, and vasoactive chemicals that are released from those damaged tissues will stimulate endothelial cells to start to contract. And when those endothelial cells contract, the gap between them will widen, and that increases the permeability of the capillary. So not just fluid can rush into that tissue, but also leukocytes and plasma proteins, all of that stuff will leave the bloodstream. And what else will leave the bloodstream will be complement antibodies and some of those clotting proteins. So here's a really nice diagram of an injury that you can see here, and that injury's brought some really nice little bacteria cells. And so these mast cells have released their histamine, and that histamine's traveling over to these endothelial cells, and those endothelial cells will contract and widen the gap between them. And that histamine will also be a chemical attractant or chemotaxis for those neutrophils, and then those neutrophils can squeeze in between the epithelial cells and start to phagocytose those pathogens. Cytokines that are released from those white blood cells will also stimulate the red bone marrow to release more neutrophils. And then the endothelial cells will also start to release selectin. And the selectin basically makes the innermost part of that capillary kind of sticky, and that will aid in the recruitment of those leukocytes. So this is why white blood cell counts go up when you have inflammation. The membranes of the tissue and the endothelial walls of the blood vessel become sticky, so leukocytes that are traveling in the blood vessel will grab on to that vessel wall, and that's called margination. And then they'll squeeze through those endothelial cells, and they'll start to crawl through the gaps and enter into the tissue fluid, and that is called diapedesis. And how do they know where to go? Like, okay, now they're in this tissue. How do they know how to get to the injury? Well, the cells are still secreting some chemicals, and they're going to follow those chemicals to the site of injury. And these cells and chemicals that have left the bloodstream are said to be extravased. So here we have a nice picture that has a splinter on it. And that splinter had some pretty little bacteria. So let's start with step one. Step one shows you the inflammatory chemicals are being released by that damaged tissue. Those inflammatory chemicals are calling white blood cells in chemotaxis. At the same time, those endothelial cells here, these guys, those endothelial cells of the capillary have released selectin. And selectin is now making that inner surface of those capillary cells sticky. So white blood cells, instead of flowing right on by, they're going to cling to the wall, which is called marginization or margination. You can see that label increased permeability in the gap between those endothelial cells are now right here. So that space is now large enough that these blood cells can get out of the blood vessels and they'll crawl out across the connective tissue. And in this case, in this diagram, it's the dermis, and they have now left the bloodstream. So these leukocytes, these neutrophils, are going to know where to go because they're going to act like bloodhounds that are going to follow the chemical and track down the chemotaxin. They're going to swim or crawl over to that site of injury, and then they're going to start to phagocytose all of that bacteria in the injury site. So the basis for the 4 cardinal signs of inflammation is heat, and that results from the increased blood flow. And also, due to the increased blood flow, we're going to have a redness, and that will also be caused from some red blood cells that have extravased into the tissue. That should be RBC, not RBS. And then that increased fluid in the tissues is swelling, which is called edema. And that's just because the fluid is going to leak out of those capillaries and go into the fluid. And all of that pressure from the edema is going to put pressure on those nerves, and that's going to cause some pain. And that is going to also stimulate pain receptors from prostaglandins. There could also be bacterial toxins and bradykinin. Bradykinin is a natural vasoactive peptide that forms during the inflammatory process. And this bradykinin acts directly on nerves and smooth muscle. And that's going to cause some pain. And there will also be some direct injury to the nerves themselves, and that's also going to cause some added pain. Okay, so step 1 is getting everybody there. Now that everybody's there, I need to contain and destroy the pathogen. I have to prevent it from spreading. So to do that, I'm going to have cells that are gobbling them up, but some can still run away and spread, so I got to stop that. That's when fibrinogen comes in. Fibrinogen is going to come in and turn into fibrin, and it's going to start forming a sticky mesh similar to clot formation. And that mesh will form all around the injured area, which will wall it off. It's going to say, you cannot leave this area. It's going to contain it. So it will form a sticky mesh, and that mesh walls off the microbes and will keep it in that area. But at the same time, I don't want the entire area to clot, because if the whole area clots, then my white blood cells can't get there. So what happens is the pathogens are in the middle, and they're going to get this little wall of fiber around them that holds them in this little fluid pocket. Outside of that area, heparin will also be released from some of those mast cells and basophils, and that's going to keep everything nice and fluid. So heparin will make sure everything around it can still flow and can still get to that site of injury. So neutrophils will start to get into that area of injury, and they will accumulate within an hour. After leaving the bloodstream, they will start to do chemotaxis and they will call in reinforcements. Those chemicals that they secrete are things like the bradykinin and leukotrienes that will cause other neutrophils to come into that site of injury. Neutrophils will respond pretty quickly and they're going to come in and kill that bacteria. The way they kill the bacteria is typically through phagocytosis. And then these neutrophils will also secrete cytokines for the recruitment of macrophages and additional neutrophils. So basically, the cytokines call for backup. Macrophages and T cells will also start to secrete colony stimulating factor, and that will stimulate the production of leukocytes or leukopoiesis in the red blood marrow. And that in turn will raise the white blood cell count in the blood. So neutrophilia, philia means to like. Neutrophilia is when there's an increase in these neutrophils. So there's approximately 5,000 cells per microliter of blood. And there's about 25,000 cells per microliter in bacterial infections. So normal is about 5,000, and then in a bacterial infection, we'll see that rise about fivefold. And then you have eosinophilia, and that's a rise or an elevation in the eosinophil count. So if there's an allergy or parasitic infection, you'll see a rise in the eosinophils. Your monocytes are like the mobilized defenses and cleanup crew. So these guys are going to roll in and they're going to make sure everything is good. They are like the final crew. They arrive about 8 to 12 hours later, and these monocytes will differentiate in the tissues and become macrophages. So once they're in the tissues, they start to engulf and destroy bacteria. If there are damaged host cells, they will take care of those and phagocytose those damaged host cells. And if there's any dead or dying neutrophils, they're going to get rid of those too. These monocytes, remember, will destroy those bacteria, and when they do, they're going to chop it up into itty bitty pieces, and then they're going to take a piece of that bacteria and they're going to display it out like a flag or a wanted poster saying, hey, let's kill this guy. He shouldn't be in here. We need to get rid of him. Let's go. So he will act as an antigen presenting cell. When we have the tissue cleanup and repair portion, there's also going to be edema because remember those endothelial cells have contracted. So there's been some excess fluid that's gone into these tissues. But that edema actually contributes to the tissue cleanup. So when you have swelling, that's going to compress the veins. And that compression will reduce how much fluid goes back into the venous system or reduces venous drainage. So that in turn forces the valves of the lymphatic capillaries to open up and promotes lymphatic drainage, which is a good thing, right? We have all those macrophages and lymphatic cells in the lymph nodes ready to clear up all of this debris and pathogens. So the lymphatic system will collect and remove all that bacteria, dead cells, proteins, and tissue debris. And that's going to start to clean up all that fluid so then the fluid can be returned to the blood. So of course I have to tell you what pus is. And pus, and we're all familiar with what pus is. It is this yellow accumulation and it's really gross looking, but if you whether you want to know what it is or not. If you look at it underneath a microscope, you will see that it's just this accumulation of dead neutrophils, whatever bacteria was there, or cellular debris, and tissue fluid. And what the body will do, well, is it will accumulate pus within an area. So if you have accumulation of pus within a tissue cavity, it forms what's called an abscess. And your body will like protect the rest of your body from this pus entering, and it will form this abscess. And as we mentioned, the increased blood supply to that tissue causes heat. And heat does have a function. So heat will actually act kind of like a catalyst. It increases metabolic rate. It also speeds the rate of mitosis and tissue repair. Fibrin clots will form this kind of scaffold for reconstruction, and pain has function too. It will limit the use of the body part so that way it has a chance to rest and heal. Okay, so let's start at the top here. We got some infectious agent, right? We cut ourselves with a dirty glass and it was like, I don't know, sitting in a dirty sink and it cut our finger. So our cells have been damaged. Well, those cells at the injury site will release bradykinin and histamine, etc. So my blood vessels are going to begin to dilate. An increase in vessel dilation and an increase in blood flow to that area is going to bring in more nutrients and oxygen into the area. It's going to increase metabolic rate of tissues, which will increase healing, and it's going to also have our capillaries in the area become more leaky. So this allows proteins to leave the bloodstream and form that fibrous or fiber barrier. It will also let the complement proteins leave that area. But when I have leaky capillaries, I also have leaked out fluid, which is why I get pain and swelling. So I'm going to have a limitation of the joint movement. And then finally, my neutrophils and monocytes are going to come in and they're going to kill everything that's left over. And they're going to start to clean up. So pain and swelling are indicators that your body is actually doing what it's supposed to do in order to heal and clean up that area. So in the last two videos, we covered the innate immune system and we did all of the first line of defense. We also did that second line of defense, and in the next video, we will focus on the B cells and T cells, which are part of the third line of defense. So this video will conclude the innate immune system. And what's going to come up next is the adaptive immune system and our third line of defense. See you then.